Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are looking at the leadership of Jesus for the next couple weeks. Last week, we looked at Jesus dealing with this epidemic disease plaguing our culture today, and that is FOMO, the fear of missing out. Jesus had that same challenge. I think we have it in epic proportions today. Social media has fueled this at epic levels. I want to go ahead and look at just some practical things that you can just expect from God and how he leads us, and probably from your leader and how they might lead you. And if you are a leader, you can go, I'm not crazy, because I've actually been leading in some ways like Jesus. So here we go. Mark chapter 9, verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. And there he was transfigured before them. Now, Jesus had 12 disciples. We know that he even had more because there was the 70 that he sent out, and there would even be more that would have been consistent followers of Christ. And he only took 3. He took his executive team. When you look at church history, his executive team was Peter, James, and John. He took the executive team off to a retreat. It was a very glorious Shangri-La retreat up on a mountaintop, breathtaking views. God the Father appears, Moses, Elijah. It was a very breathtaking experience. Number one, there will be times you are not included. Just know it. There are going to be times inside of your life that God does something in somebody else's life that he didn't do for you right then. There's going to be times your boss takes certain people to lunch and they didn't take you. They go on a treat and you didn't get to go. They went on a trip and you didn't get to go. And there's just those times that you are left out. It's what you do inside of those times when you feel excluded and how you manage your heart. Secondly, there will be times that you are not included and you're not given an explanation. You know what Jesus is not recorded doing? Going, hey, now, guys, look. You're going to be down here in the valley dealing with a bunch of management issues. I'm taking Peter, James, and John because they just really need an important experience that we're going to later use as very foundational in the church. And you know what? Let me just tell you, your turn's coming. He didn't explain nothing. He didn't explain why. And you know what? He didn't even say your turn's coming. In fact, their turn did not ever come. And you just have to be able to manage and know inside of your heart that there's just times ministry's not fair. Jobs aren't fair. Life's not fair. But God always ultimately, in the grand scheme of eternity, God is always the great equalizer in how things play out. But God doesn't have to do the same thing for everybody, and he's just not. And that's just okay. And inside of an organization, there's just going to be times you aren't included in everything, and it's how you manage your heart that really determines whether or not you break down or you break through and go to that next level. It's your job to manage your heart inside of those moments. Mark chapter 9 and verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain, as the plane kind of landed, as they were getting off, and they were getting picked up, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead, and they kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. Number 3, there's going to be times you're included and asked to keep it to yourself. This really shows a lot about somebody's ability. Can you keep some things confidential? Jesus said, hey, look, there's some things that we talked about. There's some vision. There's some things I'm showing you that are about the future. They're not for today, but I want you to keep it for yourself. The real measure of your character is, can you keep certain things secrets? Now, that wasn't sin. We're not talking about taking sin and sweeping it under the rug or, hey, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It was not that trip, okay? It was about vision things. It was about things ahead. And here's what a lot of people are tempted to do. You had an experience. You went to lunch with so-and-so, or you got to be invited into that meeting, or you were in that conference, or whatever it was that other staff didn't get to do. How do you manage that information? Do you feel the need to come back and tell everybody? Do you want to go play by play? Yeah, you know what? I was there and I met so-and-so and I heard so-and-so and I got to shake so-and-so hand. Hey, here's a selfie of me with so-and-so at that conference and that retreat. If you come back and you're braggadocious and you have to let everybody know what they missed out on, it's a really bad indication of what's going on inside of your heart. And it really just says couple things. It either says you've got a misplaced identity and you're drawing value and a sense of self-worth because you can talk about what you got and you did and you got to meet that other people didn't. And it's a sense of power. It's a power play. I feel powerful because I have power of information. I have a power of an experience that you didn't have. And it's a sign of a very insecure and dangerous leader when you do that. So can you keep certain things to yourself and not have to use it as leverage over somebody else to gain a sense of significance that I'm better than others and more important than other people on the team? Because look, I got to do this. I have had staff over the years that dealt with this, and I'm going to say have a few staff that still deal with this. And you know what? I love them, and Jesus didn't fire them because they had, insecurity issues, because the reality at the end of the day, we all have some insecurity somewhere. It just manifests a little bit differently, okay? So I'm not a perfect leader either, and I struggle with stuff too. I'm a work in progress. So it's not like, hey, we're going to go out and just fire people, and I haven't actually ever fired anybody over this. I try to pastor them through it. I try to go, hey, let's talk about this. What drives this? What's behind this? What fuels this? Why? And so I have some staff right now. We've had some conversations about some of these things. And you know what else I like to do? I like to do what Jesus does. I test them. Sometimes, as loving and graciously as I can, I intentionally create opportunities that I know are going to fuel that insecurity. Why? Because it allows it to come to the surface so that they can face it, so that they can deal with it, so that God can heal it, so that it can actually move on. Jesus talks about the vine that bears fruit and branches that don't. He prunes the ones that don't so that the others that are fruitful can bear more. As leaders, there's just times you create little tests and little scenarios so you can address these things, not because you're vindictive, not because you're harsh or mean, but because you're wanting them to become more fruitful. But if this isn't dealt with, or God isn't allowed to heal this, they're going to limit their potential inside of the organization or on side of your team. All right. Mark chapter 9, verse 14. We'll close with this point. And when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, the teachers of the law, arguing with them. What are you arguing about with them? He asked. And a man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought to you my son who's possessed by his spirit and has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him into the floor at the Target aisle because he didn't get what he wanted. Oh, I'm sorry, I got distracted there. Wrong version. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. And Jesus goes, oh, you unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? It's actually probably my favorite Bible verse. Next to Moses said, God, if you're going to treat me this way, just kill me now, complaining about the people he had to lead. Not that I've ever had difficult people to lead, okay? You're listening to this podcast. It actually tells me you're one of the best. So love you. Good job. How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. I'm just encouraged that Jesus got frustrated at times. Never sinned, but it tells me frustration is not a sin in itself. There's just times you go, oh my gosh, how long do we have to deal with this? So number 4, there are going to be times you're not included and it's not fair and it's not fun, because there's times you might not have been the one on the mountaintop. You were the one in the valley dealing with the problems. So here's what the other 9 disciples dealt with. They dealt with arguing religious leaders. That sounds familiar. Pastor, this church isn't deep enough. Pastor, we need this. Pastor, we need this regulation. We need to be more da-da-da-da. We've had it. Unbelieving parent. An unbelieving parent. I can't believe that your disciples couldn't fix all the neglect that I had in my child's life for the last 9 years. And I brought him to a service one time and your disciples and Sunday school leaders couldn't fix that. And a demon-possessed child. Again, the kid we've all seen at Target on the ground throwing a tantrum, screaming because he didn't get what he wants. Moving right along. And a noisy crowd. They had to deal with all those things. And you know what? It wasn't fair and it wasn't fun. And Jesus never one time apologized. Now, here's what we do know. Jesus rewarded them for it. There's eternal rewards that we might not see this side of heaven, but Jesus will always reward us for those things.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.